Grave markers and ceremonies relating to death are typically used to honor the deceased or remember them in some way. These are kinds of funeral traditions or rites. Other funerary traditions are used to protect the deceased in the afterlife or their journey to it and serve as a reminder of their status while they were alive. These traditions vary from culture to culture and are typically accompanied by some sort of ritual or ceremony. This anthropomorphic stele was found amongst many others like it that had an anthropomorphic but simplistic style. This has allowed historians to infer that it was located within a burial ground. Since this stele was part of what we think was a grave site, it demonstrates how the people who made it honored and respected those who had passed away by creating something to make people recall a certain person, especially warriors, as it is suspected that this grave stele belonged to a warrior. The seated scribe was placed inside the grave of an Egyptian scribe. Scribes were important at the time because they would sit, watch, and record court events. In ancient Egypt, it was important for everyone to have some sort of depiction of themselves within their grave, because that would be the form that the deceased would take on in the afterlife. Unlike most Egyptian sculptures in the CED, this one is not idealized. That is because the subject was not a pharaoh, which means he wasn't divine or considered as divine as the pharaohs. But he was still respected enough to be immortalized with this sculpture so that he could properly enjoy his time in the afterlife. The grave stele of Hegesiyo is found in a site with multiple other grave steles and grave sites. It honors a woman of high status by making her much larger than her attendant using hierarchy of scale, and by depicting her examining a pearl necklace that was once painted on at the time but is no longer visible. Her importance is also emphasized by the low relief style and frame that mimics architecture and sculpture found in Greek temples. Not to mention, Hegesiyo is barefoot, and her feet are on a stool, suggesting she is on sacred land and of high status. A grave marker like this would allow for friends and family of the deceased to visit Hegesiyo's grave and leave offerings when able to. It would also allow strangers visiting the gravesite to know that someone of high status and importance is buried here. The reliquary of Sainte-Foy was made in honor of Sainte-Foy, a young martyr who was killed for refusing to worship pagan gods. The reliquary is said to hold some of Sainte-Foy's remains. It is taken out during processions in Conquest France in remembrance of her sacrifice. This reliquary shows the importance for Christians living in the area to remember those who came before them and were persecuted for their faith by recognizing and honoring them. Unlike the previous and remaining pieces, Y no hay remedio is not a marker for the deceased, but was still created in remembrance of them. This is a piece made to be easily distributed and sold to many people so that they would be aware of the impacts and horrors of war. By doing so, the piece honors and remembers the many who died due to warfare. Covering the face of the innocent man on the post allows him to be representative of every innocent man who was killed in the war. So, while mainly intended to be a social commentary, the work has in a way memorialized the lives of many men. Templo Mayor is very different from the rest of these pieces. It was not made for honoring the deceased, but for honoring gods by using sacrifices. Aztec gods were honored with human sacrifices that would be grown from the top of the temple down to the Coxiolahi stone. The people sacrificed were typically prisoners of war, so their sacrifice was more important to the Mexica society than their role when they were alive. Reliquary figures were sculpted to protect the remains of the deceased Fang peoples. They would sit on top of a reliquary basket holding the remains and protect the deceased from spirits and those who were not allowed to view the remains, such as foreigners and women. The figures and boxes would travel with this group of nomadic people. That's why they were small enough to carry along with the baskets. Remains of men who founded important family lineages and women who gave birth to many children were often guarded by these reliquary figures. This was a way to honor and protect the spirits of the deceased after they have passed on. The funeral banner of Lady Di was either used for a funeral procession or placed over the deceased, Lady Di's, coffin. It depicts Lady Di as a woman of high status, with people who respect her. The banner not only depicts Lady Di while she was alive, but also depicts her funeral, showing a large gathering of people around her coffin. An elaborate banner such as this one, made of an expensive material, makes it even more clear that Lady Di came from a wealthy family of high status, who could afford to have her memorialized in this manner. Such a respectful way of memorializing Lady Di shows that she is someone who is highly respected in their society. Maligan displays and masks consisted of burning wooden figures and certain dances in order to send the deceased to the next world. The preparation for these ceremonies typically required a lot of time and money, so this tradition was commonly reserved for families of higher status. Either way, it honored and respected those who died in a way that would ensure that they made it to the afterlife. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial contains the names of 58,281 Vietnam veterans. It is a simple and reflective structure in order to promote meditation and reflection. The memorial cuts deep into the land to symbolize the pieces of the country that was lost with those who died in the war. It is simple and non-specific, so that it is capable of appropriately honoring all 58,281 names. These pieces demonstrate the ways that different civilizations honored the deaths of individuals in societies. In some societies, people of higher status or wealth were honored individually with funerary objects and special ceremonies for spiritual protection for their journey into the afterlife. Other societies have found ways to honor groups of people who have lost their lives by creating monument pieces or pieces that are capable of being viewed by many and represent many who have died.